Have you ever heard of ghost ships? Stories that cross the seas and remain rooted in the minds of sailors, like a constant shadow, a threat that never fades. Today, we're going to explore one of the ocean's most chilling mysteries, the terror of cursed vessels, those that emerge from the depths and, to this day, no one has dared to fully understand. Imagine being on a ship, adrift in the middle of a moonless night, when you start to see a distant silhouette. As it gets closer, you realize it's not just any ship. It's a ghostly vessel, defying all logic and the limits of the supernatural. What could these ships be? Lost souls searching for rest? Or is there something even more sinister behind this legend? Before we begin, if you're fascinated by stories like this, hit that like button now. Don't miss a single detail of this eerie journey. With each image, with each word, you'll get closer to the unknown. And here's a question. Do you believe the ocean holds secrets that will never be revealed? Answer in the comments and stay tuned to discover what really hides in the dark waters.
It was a moonless night, and the sea was quieter than usual, as if nature itself had decided to hold its breath. The darkness, thick and oppressive, stretched across the horizon, swallowing the ship and its crew in an unsettling emptiness. The solitary ship cut through the calm waters, but the atmosphere in the air was far from peaceful. The crew, who had already faced countless storms and rough seas, sensed something strange, a foreboding that spread like a whisper between the sails and the masts. Something in the ocean's shadows seemed to be watching them, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The captain, a man whose face had been hardened by time and the harsh life at sea, stood tall on the deck, his eyes fixed on the black abyss ahead. His experience had taught him to trust the signs, the smallest details that sailors learn to interpret over time, and his instincts told him they were not alone. There was something invisible, yet palpable, that deeply disturbed him. His thoughts tried to dismiss the feeling of unease. Perhaps it was just the fatigue from the long voyages, the lack of rest and the weight of endless nights. But for a moment, a cold sensation ran down his spine, and he knew, with a disturbing certainty, that he was wrong. In the absolute silence of the night, the sea seemed to follow them, relentless and silent, as if the darkness extended beyond the horizon, hiding something greater than mere unknown. The captain's eyes scanned the line of the horizon, but nothing moved, nothing appeared. The crew, now visibly tense, felt the weight of anxiety in the air. The wind was still, the sails were motionless, and the only sound that could be heard was the faint murmur of water lapping at the ship's hull. And then, a sound. Soft, almost imperceptible, but enough to freeze the blood of any sailor. A crack. A strange noise coming from below, from the very depths of the ocean. The captain bent down, trying to listen more carefully, but the sound stopped as abruptly as it had started. The air had grown heavier, as if the sea itself had closed in around them. The crew fell silent, looking to their captain, waiting for him to give some sign, some order, but he said nothing. His eyes were fixed on a distant point, as if something was calling his attention, something he couldn't fully comprehend. The sea was growing heavier, and deep within his soul, the captain knew that the worst was yet to come. Whatever was there, in the depths of the night, in the shadows of the ocean, had finally awakened. And now, there was no way to escape. The wind, which had previously pushed the vessel forward with strength, suddenly died away. The world around them plunged into a deadly silence, as if the ocean itself had decided to halt its flow, suspend its movement. The sails, which had once billowed with the breeze, now hung heavy and still, as if they too were intimidated by the stillness that had overtaken the sea. The stars, which usually illuminated the vast night with their faint light, seemed to have retreated into the depths of the night, hiding behind a curtain of impenetrable darkness. The ship, which had been slicing through the waves with a steady rhythm, now drifted aimlessly, the sound of the hull touching the water becoming the only marker of time, a monotonous and disturbing thud. With each ripple of the sea, the ship seemed to move awkwardly, as if searching for a path that no longer existed. What had once felt like a journey under the command of the wind had now become a directionless crossing, without compass, without any sign of life beyond the crew who remained silent, their eyes fixed on the empty horizon. The captain, a man with many years at sea, experienced in navigating through fierce storms and treacherous calms, felt a growing unease in his chest. He knew the solitude of the ocean, understood that sometimes the wind could vanish for a moment, a mere whim of the weather. But nothing, in all his experience, compared to this sinister stillness. Something was wrong, something he couldn't explain. He observed the sails still slack and the surface of the water, so perfect and unwavering like a mirror. There were no tides, no signs of currents, only an oppressive calm that enveloped everything around them. His instinct, usually as sharp as a blade, couldn't find an explanation for the deadly serenity that surrounded them. The sea, which should have been unpredictable and alive, was now motionless, in a state of absolute apathy, as if the very ocean was waiting for something. The captain forced himself not to think of the legends his grandmother had told him when he was young. Stories of monsters asleep in the depths, creatures that rise when the balance of the sea is broken. But the words, though distant, began to echo in his mind, until they became a disturbing reverberation. With a face marked by time and the winds he had faced, he looked at his men, who were also still, as if awaiting an order, or perhaps a sign. But what could be stronger than the silence that enveloped them? The sea was still, the ship was still, and deep within his soul, the captain knew there was something more to this night than mere calm. Something was watching, something was waiting for them. It was then that in the distance a shadow appeared. At first it seemed like an illusion, a faint blur in the vast, dark expanse of the ocean, so subtle that it could be mistaken for a flaw in vision or the very play of the waves. But as time passed and the silence stretched on, the silhouette began to take shape with an eerie precision, as if it were being pulled into reality. It was a ship, but not an ordinary one. Its sails, torn and decayed, floated in the air as if caught in an invisible vortex, billowing without the slightest hint of wind. The fabric, stretched and pierced, seemed torn to pieces, as if the very ship had been forgotten by time, abandoned, and left to decay. The hull, covered with a thick layer of moss and algae, resembled a living organism, as though the sea itself had claimed this rotten piece of wood and kept it afloat for some unknown reason. The ship's structure was crumbling, its edges breaking into small fragments as it moved forward. Yet it still defied all natural laws, sailing aimlessly, like an entity that should not exist. The crew of the solitary ship, watching in silence, felt a wave of cold run through their bodies. Some tried to glance at the captain, searching for an explanation, but he stood, motionless, his eyes fixed on what was approaching. He knew the seas, its forces and its mysteries, but nothing had prepared him for this. The ship, or what remained of it, seemed to defy logic itself. How could a vessel so destroyed still be sailing, without wind, without life, as if moved by a force beyond human comprehension? The sound of the waves crashing against the hull of the solitary ship now seemed muffled, distant, as all eyes remained locked on the shadow that drew nearer and nearer. The strange ship, that specter of the waters, glided slowly closer, as if it wanted to join the crew. There were no visible crew members, only emptiness, and the strange sensation that, as it neared, the ocean around it grew deeper, darker, as if the sea itself were being drawn to its presence. The captain took a step forward, his lips trembling with an unspoken word. He felt that something primordial was about to happen, something that would shatter the balance that kept the world intact. The ship was not a mere specter, but a warning, a presence that carried with it the weight of 1,000 lost stories, legends buried deep in the ocean's depths. And as the shadow drew closer, a sense of terror seized everyone aboard the solitary ship. They were no longer alone in the waters. Something was watching them. And perhaps, something far worse was on its way. Aboard the solitary ship, fear spread like a silent plague. The wind, once absent, returned erratically, hissing between the still limp sails, but the atmosphere remained thick and oppressive. The darkness seemed to swallow the horizon, and the shadow of the spectral ship was now so close that everyone could see it clearly, as if it were part of their fate, an extension of the sea itself. The sailors, normally men of unshakable courage, began to gather in small groups, whispering among themselves, their faces pale and their eyes uneasy. The words flowed low, heavy with dread. "Old legends," one of them said, his voice trembling. "Stories our grandparents told us, but that no one else wanted to believe." He looked around as if afraid someone might hear him, although it was obvious that everyone there shared the same fear. "Ghost ships," he continued, "that rise from the abyss, from the depths where lost souls are cursed to wander, endlessly, seeking some form of redemption." His voice faded on the last word, as if the mere act of speaking the truth was something too dangerous. Another sailor, older with a gray beard and tired eyes, lowered his head. He knew the stories were not just sailors' tales to scare the newcomers. There was truth in them, a dark energy that couldn't be denied. He tried to push the thought away, but his mind was consumed with the memory of nights spent in lonely seas, when, amidst the fog, he swore he had seen similar shadows, faceless figures moving through the calm waters. The growing murmur among the men turned into a collective whisper, a shared belief that made the atmosphere even heavier. "They don't leave," murmured one of the sailors, his eyes wide with terror, as if he had seen something no one else had noticed. His voice shook, and the tension in the air made everyone shrink. "They're waiting. They know. We're going to get closer." The words echoed in the silence, and the unease took hold of the other men, as if the mere mention of the ghost ship was enough to summon it. No one dared to contradict the sailor who had spoken, for the fear was etched on his face so raw that everyone knew he believed every word. But no one had the courage to question the truth of those words. The captain was at his post, watching the strange ships approach, but he said nothing. Perhaps he knew too. Perhaps he was just waiting. The murmurs ceased as the shadow of the spectral ship began to take a definite shape, its contours sharper and more imposing as it drew closer. No sailor dared to look directly at the captain. They knew in some inexplicable way that the time to question what was real and what was legend had ended. The ghost ship was here before them, and the stories of the ancient sailors, which had once seemed so distant, were about to become the only truth that remained. The captain, with a stern expression and piercing eyes, felt the growing threat approach, a cold sensation tightening around his throat. No matter how experienced he was with the various adversities of the sea, something about this night transcended even his worst nightmares. His leadership instinct kicked in, and he ordered the crew firmly to remain calm. "No panic," he shouted, his voice echoing across the deck. "Stay in position, follow orders." But his words, no matter how authoritative, couldn't silence the fear that spread like a plague among the men. The crew, despite their efforts to obey, couldn't tear their eyes away from the ghost ship, which was now close enough to be seen in its entirety. The ship appeared like a ghostly apparition, its form standing out against the vast, dark ocean, with a presence that seemed to make the sea itself retreat. It did not sail like any ordinary vessel. Instead of cutting through the water with the usual resistance, it seemed to float above it, moving with a supernatural grace as if the ocean itself was gently carrying it without any effort. The sails, though torn and tattered, were inflated, not by the absent wind, but by an invisible force, a force no one could explain. They rose and rippled, as if some unknown energy was pushing them, making them stretch and move against the very logic of the environment. The ship didn't seem bound by the same laws of physics that governed the world of the living. It was there, an enchanted monstrosity, a cursed legacy of the abyss, gliding across the waters with an unsettling power. The captain felt his heart tighten, but his expression betrayed none of the fear now dominating his chest. He knew that if he didn't take control of the situation, the crew would succumb to hysteria. But there was something in his gaze, a hint of doubt, something even he couldn't recognize. How could he fight the impossible? How could he face something that already defied all logic of the sea and life? The crew, now visibly terrified, began to move slowly, their eyes fixed on the horrifying sight before them. Some tried to maintain composure, while others, however, were on the verge of madness, the murmurs of dread growing louder with each passing second. What is that? What are we going to do? The questions mingled with the sounds of the waves crashing against the hull of the solitary ship, a sound now muffled, as if the sea were trying to swallow reality. The captain, still staring at the ghost ship, knew another decision needed to be made. One last attempt to maintain control. But what could be done against a presence that transcended the natural world, against an entity that shouldn't exist, but was right there, in plain view? He didn't know. All he knew was that time was running out. And as the spectral ship drew nearer, the crew's fear became a shadow of something much larger. A threat that was not only visible, but seemed to swallow all the hopes and certainties of the world. The light from the solitary ship's lanterns began to flicker, a wavering flame struggling against the growing darkness. The wind, which had previously seemed absent, now whispered, but in an irregular manner, as if the very air was hesitant, unsure, unable to follow a course. Each lamp fought to stay lit, its flickering light reflecting the rising tension that surrounded the ship. The space around them seemed to swallow the brightness, making the shadows denser, deeper, as if the ocean itself was trying to engulf the ship and its men. The silence was absolute. There was no sound of waves crashing against the hull, nor the rustling of sails. The sea, which always seemed to hum with the energy of motion, was now still, as if suspended, waiting for what was to come. And as the silence dragged on, a sense of foreboding overtook each member of the crew. It was an oppressive feeling, a pressure on the chest that made hearts beat faster, lungs tightening. The men, usually hardened by the hardships of the sea, were now restless, eyes fixed on the shadows around them, hands trembling, bodies tense. The sailors began exchanging quick glances, unsure of what to do, as if they were waiting for some sign, some order to guide them through the immobilizing stillness. But despite all the anxiety in the air, no one dared to speak a word. The captain stood at the bow, watching the darkness, his eyes fixed on the ghost ship that was drawing nearer. His jaw was clenched, his teeth pressed together so tightly that his cheeks seemed to begin to distort. He tried to maintain composure as he always did, but within his mind, things were beginning to crumble. He knew he was facing something beyond his understanding. His experience, gained over years of navigating treacherous seas and violent storms, had never prepared him for this. The sea, he understood. The winds and waves he controlled. But this was different. The ship before them did not obey the laws of nature. There was no logic, no reason that could explain its presence, its form, its supernatural movement. The captain knew this wasn't just a lost ship, but something deeper, darker, something that defied everything he believed was possible. Still, he could not show his doubt. He could not let fear take over, not in front of his crew. The weight of leadership demanded that he remain strong, that he be the beacon in the storm, even if he was uncertain of everything. He took a deep breath, trying to push away the feeling of despair beginning to creep into his heart, and slowly turned to face the sailors. They were all watching him, waiting for an order, a command, something that would tell them how to react to this indescribable threat. But the captain had no answers. He did not know what lay behind that apparition, nor what that shadow carried with it. But there was one thing he knew for certain. Something was about to happen, something that would change everything. And the only thing he could do, the only thing he knew how to do, was to face the unknown head-on. The light of the lantern, still trembling, illuminated the expression on his face, hardened by tension. And as the ship neared the abyss of the unknown, the captain knew that the true storm was about to break loose, and there was no escape. As the ghost ship drew closer, something indescribable happened. The sea, which had been in a deadly silence up until that point, seemed to swallow itself, as if the ocean itself had ceased to exist for a moment. Then, like an underground thunderclap, a distorted scream broke the silence. It was not a human scream, but something much deeper, something immense and primal, a grotesque mix of pain and anger that seemed to emanate from the very guts of the ghost ship. The sound dragged, scratched through the waves, cutting the air with a violence that made the crew's skin crawl. It was a scream that did not come from a living being, but from something lost, condemned to an eternity of suffering and revenge. The crew froze. Their eyes widened, fixed on the horizon where the shadow of the ship loomed, a presence that seemed to devour all the light around it. Their bodies stiffened, immobilized by terror, as if they were being pulled into an invisible abyss. The screams still echoed in their minds, reverberating like a curse. The ship itself, the solitary ship, seemed to bow under the weight of that malevolent force. The air around them grew denser, as if the sea and the night had joined forces against them, trying to swallow every breath, every movement. The captain, his posture still rigid and imposing, looked at the horizon with an expression that mixed courage with a faint shadow of doubt. He knew the situation was beyond anything he had ever faced, but, as a leader, he could not show weakness. His eyes were fixed on the ghost ship drawing nearer, now visible in all its abominable glory. The tattered sails and crumbling hull were no longer just symbols of abandonment. They were the very embodiment of a curse hanging over the sea. He knew that if the ship got close enough, the crew could be dragged into a terrible fate. With a shout that tried to cut through the thick air of fear, the captain commanded, "Stay together!" His voice, though firm, seemed small in the face of the approaching threat. But the words were more a reflection of what he hoped for than a real command. Fear had infiltrated his men, making them almost incapable of reacting. The sound of the scream that had broken the silence still reverberated in their bodies, and they all knew, deep down, that the order to remain united was a last act of desperation. Nothing else seemed capable of driving away what was coming. The ghost ship, now so close that the grotesque details were visible. The sails swollen by an invisible force, the hull covered in algae and moss like a carcass defying time, moved with a supernatural calm, as if the sea itself were carrying it, obeying an ancient, malevolent will. The captain, with his teeth clenched, felt a chill run down his spine. He knew that what lay ahead was not just a manifestation of the supernatural. It was a presence, a force that cared nothing for the men aboard a mere ship. As the crew gathered, their bodies stiff and their hearts racing, the captain felt the line between life and death fading. The scream, now louder, closer, resonated in their bones, and he no longer knew if it was the sea or something far worse calling them to the abyss. All that remained was the uncertainty of what would come next, and he feared, more than anything, that whatever was necessary to face that force was beyond his abilities, beyond everything the sea had ever taught him. A being, taller than the others, materialized before the captain, emerging from the shadows as if it had been woven by the darkness itself. Its presence was overwhelming, an imposing figure with tattered and torn robes that seemed more like webs of mist than fabric. The air around it seemed to freeze, the winds ceasing entirely as it took shape, as if time itself hesitated to touch it. Its face was obscured, an indistinct mass of shadows that allowed no glimpse of its features. But its eyes were what truly terrified. They glowed with a supernatural intensity, like flaming lanterns in the depths of an abyss, with a light that seemed to reflect the misery and eternity of something lost far beyond death. The captain, though hardened by decades of navigation, felt his stomach tighten and his heart race as he faced this figure. There was nothing human in that presence, nothing familiar. His muscles tensed, ready to react, but something kept him from moving, from speaking. It was as though the very air was saturated with an oppressive energy, a force that froze his instincts. When the being spoke, the voice was not that of a man. It was something much older, deeper, a presence that crawled from the abyss, echoing from a time so remote that no human being could understand it. The voice resonated on the deck, cold and dragged out, as if it were not made of words, but of echoes from the very depths of the ocean. There were no emotions in it, only the perception of an entity that had been lost beyond human understanding, a being that had long forgotten what it meant to be human. The tone was heavy, as if each syllable carried the weight of millennia, the burden of an existence that should never have been. You do not belong here, the being said, its words dragging like chains in the deep waters. This sea is a tomb, and you, sailor, are destined to be lost in it like so many before you. The voice vibrated, reverberating in every plank of the ship, in every fiber of the captain's body. He could feel, with each word, that he was being pulled toward something much greater, something beyond mere danger. The being before him was not a common enemy. It was the personification of an ancient power, something the very sea carried in its darkest belly. The captain's eyes, fixed on the flames in the being's eyes, tried in vain to find some weakness, some sign of vulnerability. But nothing was there. Only the deep void, a consciousness that seemed to have surpassed death and time itself. The being before him was no longer bound by the limitations of the living. It existed only to observe and to exact the price for what humanity had forgotten, the price of defying the ocean's oldest secrets. Go! The voice continued, and the captain felt the air around him tighten, as if the words were a physical pressure. Go, or you will stay here forever, like us, forgotten, condemned to wander in eternal darkness. The being extended its hand, but its fingers were liquid shadows, as if the very substance of its existence were disintegrating in the air. The captain, despite the terror that paralyzed him, managed to swallow the dry saliva that had formed in his throat. He didn't know if he could escape this entity, but one thing was certain. Whatever stood before him was no longer a lost soul. It was the abyss itself, the eternal oblivion that the sea kept in its bosom, waiting for men bold enough to challenge its domain. And now, he and his crew were at the edge of what was known. The entity watched him, and the last thing the captain heard before the world around him disappeared was the voice whispering, like a wave approaching and crashing over a ship. Choose your death, sailor. You are condemned, the figure said, its voice echoing like a lament that pierced the soul. Each word seemed to puncture the silence, tearing through the air with a deep sadness, a sense of inevitability that infiltrated the captain's bones. The voice was not human, but something much older, deeper, carrying the weight of an existence beyond death. It crawled through the waves of time, like a whisper coming from the depths of the ocean, resonating in the forgotten memories of ships that had sunk and men who had disappeared without a trace. The captain stood paralyzed, his blood freezing in his veins, as the figure before him remained still, its presence like a living shadow. The entity, a nightmare creature, seemed to feed on the darkness around it, growing even more imposing as the flickering light of the solitary ship's lanterns reflected in its eyes. Those eyes shining like lanterns in the depths, like beacons guiding lost souls to their end. The air was thick, heavy, as if the very night had closed in on the ship. The sea has already claimed your fate, the figure continued, and its voice spread like a silent wave, swallowing everything around. Each word felt like a sentence, as if the sea, in all its vastness and mystery, had already decided the end of this moment. The captain tried to breathe, tried to understand, but his mind was stunned by the magnitude of what was happening. The sea, always an unpredictable force, a force to be challenged or respected, now seemed something far more personal. It was no longer the vast, impersonal ocean he knew. It was a presence, a force that had decided the fate of all aboard. He knew he could not deny what was being said. The presence before him was no longer a specter, no longer a legend or a nightmare. It was the sea itself in its purest and most terrifying form, claiming what had once been its own. And the captain, no matter how many stormy seas he had navigated and how much chaos he had faced in the most violent tempests, knew, deep inside, that there was no escape. The crew, who had gathered on deck, stood in silence, their eyes fixed on the captain, waiting for some direction, some action. But there was no more action to be taken. Their fate was already sealed. The voice of the entity seemed to fill the space around them, the ship now drifting in a sea of uncertainty and hopelessness. The sea has already claimed your fate, the figure repeated, as if confirming the sentence that had been passed. And upon hearing those words, the captain felt an immense weight on his chest, as if the ocean itself was on his shoulders, pushing him toward an inevitable end. There was no struggle, no escape. The sea was no longer just the environment in which he sailed. The sea was the force that now governed everything, and his fate, and that of his crew, had already been sealed. Silence descended once again, heavy and profound, as the ship, now at the mercy of the invisible currents of the abyss, seemed to slowly be swallowed by the darkness around it. The captain, looking at the figure before him, felt that there was no more room for resistance. They were doomed, and somewhere in the depths of that silent sea, the echo of the death sentence resounded, calling them to their end. The captain, though consumed by fear, did not move. His muscles were tense, frozen by the presence of the entity, but he knew he could not succumb to the paralysis that threatened to overtake his body. His hand trembled slightly on the helm, the cold wood against his sweaty skin, but he kept it firm, as if the very act of steering the ship was the last trace of his sanity. Every breath was a struggle, and his heart pounded, as if the darkness around him was squeezing him, trying to crush him with the weight of his helplessness. But the captain did not yield. He was a man of the sea, a leader, and he could not show weakness before his crew, even though he was facing something that defied all the laws of nature and reason. "Who are you? What do you want?" he asked, his voice faltering but still with an unexpected strength, a last attempt to maintain control. Each word that left his mouth seemed like a scream in the void, a desperate grasp at reality. He knew his voice trembled, but what was at stake demanded one last demonstration of courage. The figure before him, still cloaked in shadows, did not respond immediately. The silence dragged on, deep and thick, as if the very universe were waiting for the answer. The sea, which had been still before, now seemed even more oppressive, as if the waves and winds were held back, awaiting an answer no one knew what would be. The presence of the entity was overwhelming, and the captain knew that the words he had just spoken were his last attempt at understanding, at some explanation that could make them grasp what was happening. Finally, the figure moved, not in a natural way, but as though it were dragging itself through space, as if its form were more shadow than flesh, a manifestation that defied reality itself. The entity's glowing eyes fixed on the captain's, and for a moment the man felt as if time had stopped. Those eyes, they were like beacons in an endless night, burning with the promise of something he was not ready to understand. "You are no longer in control," the voice said, more of a lament than a statement, dragging itself through the words. "The sea possesses you now, and what it wants cannot be avoided." The captain, who had always known what it meant to sail through rough seas, now understood that he was facing something that could neither be challenged nor understood. It was not a storm, nor a creature of the sea, but something that surpassed any category he knew. The sea now was no longer just a space he navigated. It was a living force, and he and his crew were at its mercy. The terror that had settled in his chest now ran deeper, more real. There was no fighting the sea. There was no escaping what had already been decided. And as the voice of the entity echoed in his mind, he knew that the real battle had already begun, and that the fate of all aboard was irrevocably sealed. The figure smiled, but the gesture brought no comfort. On the contrary, it was a hollow smile, devoid of any humanity, as if the very concept of affection and compassion had been disintegrated in the depths of the abyss. "We want nothing. We are nothing." The words echoed on the deck of the lone ship, their meaning reverberating in the minds of each sailor. A cruel and definitive sentence. The nothing it spoke of was not any ordinary void, but a presence that consumed everything around it, a force that erased light, hope, and eventually existence itself. The feeling of an immense weight, as if the very souls of the captain and his crew were being sucked into that endless emptiness, spread throughout everyone aboard. And with those words, the figure vanished. It was not a common departure, like someone retreating into the darkness. It was as if it had never been there, as if its body and essence had dissolved into the very air. The shadow of the figure dissolved into the abyss of the ghost ship, which now began to slowly drift away, like an entity retreating back to the depths from which it had emerged. The ship, with its decaying hull and sails billowing from an invisible force, seemed to dissolve into the darkness, taking with it the promise of more nightmares. The lone ship remained silent, the sound of the waves now muffled, as if the sea itself was held back, tense, waiting. The crew, still paralyzed by terror, could barely breathe. The eyes of each man were fixed on the spot where the ghost ship had vanished, trying, in vain, to understand what had just occurred. The air was cold, the lanterns trembled, and the fear that had invaded their minds now seemed like a palpable presence, an invisible specter that would accompany them until the end. The captain, his eyes fixed on the faint line where the ship had disappeared, could not move. Every fiber of his being screamed to understand, to react, but he was immersed in a deep state of shock. The truth was clear, yet impossible to accept. This was not an illusion. It was not a passing storm or a nightmare that could be forgotten with the dawn. No, the ghost ship and its crew were not mere apparitions. They were the embodiment of a curse, of a primordial and unfathomable force that had now descended upon them. A chill ran down the captain's spine. The ship would not leave them in peace. The sea would not free them. They were now between what had been lost and what should never have been found. The curse had been cast, and the lone ship was bound to a fate it could no longer escape. The silence grew oppressive, and as the ship continued its journey through the calm and treacherous waters, each man knew, deep down, that this was not merely the end of a voyage. It was the beginning of something much darker, something that would follow them to the end, until the ocean swallowed them, just as it had swallowed those who had come before. The lone ship continued its journey, but something was different. The wind, which had once pushed the sails with force, now seemed to whisper in silence, as if hesitant to touch the ship. With every wave that rose and shattered against the hull, a shiver ran down the spine of each sailor. There was no longer a man aboard who didn't feel the presence of terror, like an invisible shadow hovering over them, always lurking. The sky, which had once seemed vast and open, now appeared darker, as if a thick cloud of mystery and uncertainty had settled above them. The stars could barely pierce through the mist that now seemed to have taken over the open sea, a suffocating darkness that swallowed any fragment of light. The horizon, which had once promised a new destination, now looked like a black vortex, a thin line guiding them deeper into the unknown. The water had changed as well. The sea, which had always been unpredictable, now seemed denser, as if it were becoming a viscous substance weighing down on the ship's hull. Every wave that formed seemed to drag itself with a supernatural slowness, and when it crashed against the ship, the sound was no longer the vibrant crack that sailors knew, but a muffled and cold noise, as if the ocean itself were breathing heavily, claiming the vessel as its own. None of the sailors dared speak of what had happened, of the ghost ship and the spectral figure that had confronted them. The words were trapped in the throats of all, as if a curse had silenced them. But even though their lips were sealed, they all felt it. The fear was palpable, a weight on their chests that no one could shake off. The captain, who had always been firm and determined, now walked the deck with his eyes fixed on the horizon, as if searching for something he didn't even know what it was. But his posture was no longer that of a confident leader. It was that of a man who had been marked by something beyond his comprehension. The ghost ship, with its torn sails and decaying hull, continued to haunt them, not physically, but as an invisible shadow moving alongside the lone ship, reminding them every moment that they were trapped in something they could not control. The presence of that cursed vessel hovered over them, and even without appearing again, they all knew it was still there, lurking, waiting, watching. The crew now was no longer just composed of sailors. They were part of something bigger, something beyond their individual destinies. They were now part of the legend, characters in a tale that had been written by the waters of the ocean and the hands of a force no one would dare challenge. The sea, with all its vastness and power, was no longer just a boundary between the known and the unknown. It had become a living entity, a specter rising above them, reminding them that their journey was now irrevocably tied to a fate they could not escape. The lone ship pressed on, but its crew already knew there was no turning back. They had been touched by the curse of the sea, and now they were condemned to wander the waters until the abyss claimed them, as it had with so many others before. The ocean now owned them, and with that, they were bound, not just to the ship, but to the story that would spread across generations, a tale of terror and mystery, a tale that somehow would become theirs. The next morning, the lone ship sailed aimlessly. The sky, gray and foggy, hung heavily over the vessel, offering no promise of a new dawn, as if time itself had stopped, leaving them suspended in a limbo. The water, once blue and alive, now appeared darker, denser, as if the ocean itself were burdened with something deep and malevolent. Every wave that formed and broke against the hull no longer carried the usual lightness, but instead a sinking feeling, as though the water was hiding a dark secret, poised to swallow the ship. No sailor dared speak of what had happened. The words were trapped in their throats, as if the same darkness that had overtaken the sea was now inside each of them. The captain, who had always known how to command with confidence, now walked with his head down, his steps heavy, as if the weight of everything that had occurred had aged him in a single day. His eyes were dull, as though they had seen the impossible. And indeed they had. The lone ship was no longer the same, and neither was its crew. Something irremediable had touched them, and no one knew how to move forward after being marked by such an experience. The encounter with the ghost ship was not an isolated event. The captain knew this with a bitter certainty that tore at his soul. The sight of the spectral vessel, with its tattered sails and decaying hull, was not a one-time warning or a whim of fate. No, that apparition, that contact with something that defied all rational explanations, was a reminder that the sea, with all its vastness and beauty, was also a place inhabited by forces far beyond human understanding. Something deeper and older than any navigation or cartography could reveal. The sea held secrets that men should never seek, and those who dared challenge its silence would, inevitably, be touched by its shadows. The captain felt this truth now in his bones, every movement of his body heavy with the sensation of being watched, of something following him, waiting for the right moment to emerge from the depths. The words of the entity that had spoken before still echoed in his mind. The sea has already taken your fate, and he knew those words were more than just a threat. They were a sentence. They had crossed an invisible line, a boundary from which there was no return. The crew was tense, the men with their heads bowed, as if they feared looking at the sea and seeing something they should not. Each seemed lost in their own thoughts, their own fears, but they all shared the same burden. They knew they were now immersed in a legend, not as storytellers, but as characters in a horror tale that had already been written by invisible hands. The lone ship would not leave them in peace. The ocean, with its unsettling calm and heavy waters, was now irrevocably connected to them. The captain felt the weight of the future closing in on him. There was a loneliness in that sea, a kind of silence he had never known before. The ocean, once a vastness to be conquered, now presented itself as a mystery that could not be solved, a force that could not be defeated. And as the ship continued on its uncertain course, he knew that regardless of where it took them, the sea had already decided their fate. And with that, they were at the mercy of something far greater than they could comprehend or control. And so, the lone ship continued its journey, gliding through the dark waters with the heavy silence that hung over the crew. The wind, though still present, seemed weaker, as if it too felt the weight of the threat surrounding them. With every sail that inflated, with every wave that broke against the hull, there was an increasing sensation that the sea was watching them, waiting. Something was down there, in the depths, awaiting the right moment to take what belonged to it. Every sailor knew this. They knew that the encounter with the ghost ship had not been just an accident but a milestone, a cruel reminder that the ocean was not merely a space to be crossed, but a force that ruled with invisible hands, taking what it desired without mercy. They were adrift, not just on the sea but in their fate. Somewhere in the unfathomable depths, the ghost ship watched them, its spectral crew still wandering in search of lost souls to feed the endless hell that had imprisoned them. The sailors' eyes were constantly turned toward the horizon, but no longer in the hope of finding land. Not anymore. Now every gaze was an attempt to find something they could not name, a presence that could not be ignored, but one they also could not face directly. The ghost ship, with its tattered sails and decaying hull, was a specter that haunted them in every sigh of the wind, in every echo of the sea. The captain, who had once taken pride in the confidence he inspired in his crew, now bore the weight of despair. His eyes, once steady, were clouded, as if a thick fog had settled in his mind, and silently, he knew there was no longer any control. The fate that now guided them was the sea itself, and what the ocean desired, no one could stop. They were more than a lost crew. They were pawns in a story written by something much older, more powerful, something that would keep them at the mercy of what no one dared challenge. The night felt eternal, and the sea, with its vastness and immensity, became an unsettling void. With each passing day, the feeling that something was watching them grew stronger, more tangible, as if the ghost ship was not just adrift in the depths, but watching every movement, waiting for the right moment to claim more souls for its cursed crew. And so, as the lone ship sailed through the dark waters, one thing was certain: the ocean would never forget, and the ghost ship with its eternal terror would never leave them in peace. They were trapped in an endless cycle, a journey with no destination, silently waiting for the moment they would be consumed by what the sea had kept for them.
Thank you so much for watching until the end. If this story gave you chills, imagine how your friends will react when they discover this mystery. Sharing the content is a great way to explore the unknown together and spark everyone's curiosity. If you liked what you saw, don't miss the next video that will pop up on the screen. I'm sure it will keep you on the edge of your seat, ready for more terrifying adventures. See you there.